Welcome to the ASI-pilled. This is Alex Wissner-Gross against Alvin Wang Graylin, pulled from the Moonshots podcast and reshaped for the ASI-pilled. China is not behaving like anyone there believes superintelligence is close. Tonight we find out why. China is not acting like anyone in Beijing believes superintelligence is close. Our guest has spent 30 years inside that system. So what do they see that we do not?
They are not behaving like they believe ASI is around the corner.
Why do you believe getting clarity and some resolution on the US-China AI race is so important right now?
Having a race condition forces people to make irrational decisions. At some point, we will get to a superintelligence type of a scenario. If and when we do, the concept of nations will probably become a lot less important than they are today. The AI sector alone is worth more than the GDP of America today. That, to me, is a sign that we are in a very, very fragile place and an economic correction is due.
What I hear you saying in your war game is sometime in the next 2 years, there's a private credit bubble that the US is using to finance its data center build out. The bubble pops, and then the US asks China to help financially in return for what, a quid pro quo regarding Taiwan?
Alvin Wang Graylin ran HTC in China and now war games the US and China through to superintelligence. He thinks the race everyone is running is the wrong race.
So in fact, this is probably one of the most critical questions that we need to get resolved, because it's having a race condition forces people to make irrational decisions. And right now, there is a perceived race condition. And it's based on some assumptions that I think are actually misguided or maybe misunderstood. Is that there is a perception that there is a finish line. There's a perception that the world is zero sum. There is a perception that whoever gets to AI first or AGI first can somehow rule the world forever, right? And this is a certain segment of the policymaking circles have this belief, and a certain portion of Silicon Valley elites have this type of belief, right? So I think that narrative, forces the whole discussion into a national security issue, when the reality is right now, none of those assumptions are really based on real data today, right? We don't know. Well, first of all, we do know that the world is not zero sum. I mean, as you guys talk about every day, right? Every episode, the world's getting better. We're getting more resources. We're getting more abundant. So it is not a zero sum game. And there is no clear finish line, right? In the sense of, as these technologies get better, they're progressing. And as you mentioned with all of these open source models, when the difference gap is moving from a year and a half to now probably 2 or 3 months gap between the open source and the closed source models, there is no finish line where you say, okay, we've won. Right? It's not like the space race, right? The space race, you say, hey, we've landed on the moon, we've won, there is an end. Whereas a arms race type model that we are in today, it's a constant spend and a constant pursuit, without, clear value being returned.
Yeah, maybe just to pull on the thesis, Alvin, I think that's latent that there isn't an end game. I'd love to understand how you think about this. From my perspective, there's an obvious end game. There's space, there's development of the solar system, there's interstellar exploration, all of which I expect to be fulsomely and holistically supported by superintelligence. Surely somewhere among the various scenarios that I assume you're analyzing, there are scientific and engineering endgames, quote unquote, that are intrinsically valuable to pursue. Is it your thinking that science and engineering and solving everything, as it were, is not the end game? Is there some other non-end game that you have in mind? Do you think that this is sort of a Red Queen type scenario where intelligence is just sort of endlessly racing as an end to itself, or is there an honest to goodness afterwards, after the singularity, in your mind as it pertains to US v China?
Yeah, so I think what you're describing in terms of at some point we will get to a superintelligence type of a scenario, that may be. But if if and when we do, the concept of nations will probably become a lot less important than they are today, right? The reason that we've created nations, it's actually started with city-states, right? Is because we wanted to protect a certain level of resources, and we wanted to defend and gain additional resources. In a world where we actually do achieve ASI and we get the kind of abundance that Peter and all of you have been talking about for ages, then the need to have separate nations with these type of competition really would not exist. If it still existed, then we would probably have destroyed ourselves, right? So I think
To make sure then I understand your thinking on this, am I understanding correctly that your worldview is basically fulsomely developed superintelligence naturally yields to world government on the one hand and everything else post-superintelligence, as it were, being solved, and those two, world government and post-superintelligence, are inextricably linked?
I think that they're at the point, if we can get a aligned, peaceful superintelligence, then we will naturally move to a more world government, maybe a galaxy government type of a model. But it is not something that I think is imminent, and it is not something that will happen without some level of turmoil, right? So I think the important part is about how do we get there, right? I agree with you in terms of where the long-term goal is going. But right now, I don't think in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, which is what we're really racing against. We're trying to build. We're building 10 times more data centers than China is, and to be 1 or 2 or 3 months ahead, it's not clear that the value is actually there.
And what is, just a quick follow-up question, what is your perceived timeline for world government and post-superintelligence? You mentioned it's not 2 to 5 years. Is it 10 years? What's the timeline?
I mean, I think the whole evolution of this is going to take probably on the order of decades, maybe by the end of this century. I think we will get to a point, and in fact, I think we need to move at a pace that the world can adapt. And trying to move too quickly actually creates a lot of instability in the world. If you look at the prior industrial revolutions, it was 80, 60, and 40 years respectively in playing out. And, we're talking about this revolution going from, where we are today to the singularity in five years, and according to some folks. That is not a speed that the world can adapt to, even though
digest.
Yeah, because and when that happens, turmoil happens, and it creates instability, and it may actually move the civilization backwards.
Here is the tell. Beijing is telling its own labs not to buy the American chips they are finally allowed to buy.
But if you look at the behavior of how the Chinese government is operating, they are not behaving like they believe that ASI is around the corner. Right? If they did, they would not be telling their labs, don't buy the H200s that the Americans are giving them. They would not be putting out regulation that is slowing them down, which they've had regulations around AI, privacy, data provenance, marking, transparency and marking in public, child addiction, anthropomorphizing AI. All these regulations have been around, and every single model that is released in China has to be reviewed by the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which again delays it by weeks or months, right? So they're seeing this as something that is akin to other technologies that has happened, and they understand that general purpose technology usually takes, even when it's invaded and mature, it takes years, if not decades, to actually diffuse into society, and they're behaving like that. So I think there's definitely a difference between maybe Beijing and DC in terms of how they're looking at it. One thing I will say that there are probably 2 or 3 labs in China that are a little bit AGI-pilled, not maybe to the level of the Silicon Valley folks, but their goal is very kind of idealistic and aspirational to say, hey, we also want to create AGI. But in general, the majority of Chinese labs as well as Chinese regulators see this as a technology that is not dislike other technologies.
Maybe let me pull on that a little bit, Alvin. So what I think I hear you saying is the Chinese Communist Party leadership has not yet perhaps woken up, assuming you believe the premise that we're in the middle of a singularity and that recursive self-improvement is already here. Perhaps the CCP has not yet fully woken up to that possibility. What do you think it would take? What technical development, what geopolitical development would it take, assuming that premise is correct, for the CCP to wake up and say, oh my goodness, we need to treat this as a national emergency in order to compete for recursive self-improvement, throw all of these regulatory speed bumps, we've talked about it on the pod in the past, you alluded to re-education camps. It's been widely reported that China makes all of their own labs, frontier models, pass certain ideological tests before they can be released. What would it take for the Chinese government to say, throw caution to the wind in order to compete? We have to just...
I don't think it's necessarily a thing that they don't know about, these concepts of ASI and RSI. They understand this stuff. And there are actually multiple safety institutes and AI safety contingent that is in China telling these stories to the regulators, and they hear it. In fact, at the World AI Conference, there was multiple discussions and forums specifically around AI safety. So, and there was people from the U.S., the Benjuels and the Tegmarks were also there to add these type of points to the agenda. So I don't think it's that they don't know it. I think it's that they don't believe that it is something that is necessarily and should necessarily be a nation versus nation issue. In fact, I think it's on the agenda to talk about the World AI Cooperation Organization, which they had announced on the first day of the World AI Conference, which is their version of Pax Silica. But Pax Silica from the U.S. that was launched at the end of last year was a U.S.-led organization that was talking about how do we keep U.S. dominance and leadership in AI, and which allies are we going to pick to be on our side? So it creates a block to say, we want to be the winning block. Whereas what they announced was to say, hey, look, we want to create a global organization, make AI a public good, make it shared, and everybody shares in the benefit. Anybody that wants to join can join. And they're going to put out thousands of training centers and training facilities, compute facilities, resources to the members that are joining. And I think 29 countries joined. And there's about 25 in the Pax Silica. So it's creating two blocks. But so here's something that is interesting is I actually talked to one of the people that was involved in organizing this, and I said, look, wouldn't it be good if you actually invited the U.S. to join? They're like, oh no, we would. It would be amazing if the U.S. would join. We would want them to join, and in fact, they should join. And I said, well, but if they join, you can't call it Waco because that's a Chinese-led organization. They're like, oh, if you guys are interested, we would be open to changing the name. We would be open to having a truly global organization. So I think this narrative of a us and them and, they're trying to take over the world with their AI, I don't really see that.
I maybe at the risk of belaboring the point, I just want to press again on what my question was, which is what technical threshold or event would it take for, putting aside geopolitical competition, put that aside for a minute, what would it take for superintelligence to actually cause the CCP to say, we have to actually abandon all of our internal regulations intended presumably to maintain social stability and the supremacy of the existing regime, as well as external efforts to create blocks, put the blocks aside for a minute. what threshold of superintelligence, either achievement or technical development, or maybe implications for weapons systems, if that's really what it takes, what technical achievement would superintelligence have to pass, or what threshold would it have to achieve in order for the CCP to decide in your mental model, gosh.
DeepSeek open sourced a frontier model and got its hands slapped for it. Then Xi Jinping changed his mind. So was the open weight wave a strategy or an accident America caused?
So the whole open source strategy, people think, oh, this is Chinese strategy to destroy American economics and pop this bubble. The reality is that it's an emergent strategy, right? And in fact, I was talking to friends at DeepSeek a little bit after they came out, and before that, nobody knew who they were. Right. They were not on the radar. They were not funded by the government. Nobody told them to open source. But the CEO of the company is very open source minded. And he thought that, hey, open sourcing is something that I should do because this is a great technology. I want to share it with everyone. And in fact, when they first did that, they got their hands slapped because the government's like, hey, this is such a great model. Why are you open sourcing it? But because of all of the kind of, I guess, soft power value, the PR value that came out from, having a local champion, they then became celebrated, right? And then, essentially most of the companies in China were following this because it became kind of the de facto emergent standard. And now, at the last Waco, or the WAIC announcement, Xi Jinping finally said, hey, we think open source is a good strategy. And that's kind of goes to what Dave's talking about, right? In terms of when he says that, now pretty much, most new companies are going to be focused on open source because that's the high level instruction, right?
If DeepSeek had been a closed model that succeeded, do you think China would have gone that direction? Is it really just that seed led to this, incredible open source movement in China?
Well, I mean, there were open and closed models for the whole time, right? In fact, if you look at ByteDance, they have the Doubao model, which is a closed model, right? And their Cdance model is a closed model, and they're also quite successful. So both models exist. But you're right. I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if the push for open source would have been as great. But the one thing that we also need to remember is that open source was a little bit of a necessity that U.S. policies pushed on them. Right. You had mentioned the export controls earlier, and export controls, you first talked about export controls in the software export controls of Fable. But actually before that, for several years now, 4 or 5 years, there's been export controls on chips and allocation of EDA software and lithography equipment and so forth. And what that's done is that it's forced them not to have the latest and greatest equipment. It's forced them to have to innovate with low resources. And that essentially pushed DeepSeek and all these other companies to get more innovative. Whereas the US, because they have so much resources, they've been much more focused on brute force and brute scaling, whereas the Chinese have not. And open source was necessary for them because by open sourcing, now rather than having a lab with 100 or 200 people, when you open source it, you were saying that it's been 100,000 or more of the Qwen variants. Essentially, the rest of the world helps you modify and improve your models, right? And that's a great way to leverage the global community of millions of AI researchers. The other thing that's truly important is inference, right? For you to do inference, you need to have compute. And if the Chinese labs and the Chinese hyperscalers can't buy the compute, then by open sourcing it, essentially all the hyperscalers and neoclouds around the world are buying compute, hosting these AI models, and allows them to distribute their models without the high capex that the U.S. labs are burdened with.
Hold on, Alvin.
Which aspect do you want to?
Maybe let me pull on that a bit, because in my mental model, which you can perhaps help me to refine, there are two different separable concerns by the CCP. One is retaining CCP control and dominance within China, on one hand, and on the other hand, it's maintaining competitiveness and peaceful rise, and Xi Jinping thought on a global stage, and Belt Road Initiative and geopolitical competition with a Western bloc on the other. And these two different arms may be in competition with each other. The CCP at some point, as superintelligence capabilities continue to increase, may be forced to decide whether it prefers either retaining domestic control on the one hand or seeking to continue to rise geopolitically on a global stage. How do you think about that?
Issues. What I think would get them to be really concerned if they start to see the U.S. using this model as a weapon, as an aggressive kind of offensive tool. Right, because then it becomes okay. Do we want to, what the Mythos models were essentially held back to say, hey, here's a model that can be done, and I think for some right reasons, you want to neuter the offensive capabilities before you put it out to the rest of the world. So this is actually a good thing, but. In some cases, I would actually think that it would make sense rather than having 50 companies that are being allowed is actually to allow most government organizations to have access to this, because you really want global stability. And global stability means that countries can have access to it, find the vulnerabilities in their systems. Because I don't think the Chinese want the American financial system to go down, and the Americans don't want the Chinese financial and their grid to go down, because when instability happens in any big country, the world suffers, right? And smart people understand this. But, too many, I think, folks with relatively narrow perspectives think that, one country wants to actually have another country fail. Having major superpowers fail creates irrational actions. And societal stability usually is the preeminent priority of most major governments.
Anthropic says Chinese labs are running a distillation attack. Our guest went and did the arithmetic on that claim.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they're the ones that are lobbying the government to say, hey, we need to, we're being distillation attacked, which is actually a word that they kind of invented. The reality is that every lab, both domestic and international, distills from each other. Right, and they distill within the organizations themselves, from larger to smaller ones. And in fact, if you look at the numbers of what Anthropic put out, they were saying that 20,000 accounts from 3 different labs in China, and 1 million or 2 questions that came in. I went back and actually did a estimate of what it would cost to do the number of queries based on the average responses on their highest models, and it was like $2 or $3 million. Right. So it's $2 or $3 million of across 3 different labs, and for DeepSeek, I think it was only in the thousands of dollars. Right. So the numbers sound big when you look at them in isolation, but when you look at them in aggregate, it really doesn't mean much. If you have a model that you spend $1 billion on, and somebody can distill and duplicate with a couple $1 million, then the whole economics of frontier AI doesn't make sense. Right. Now, here's the thing that also, just to give comparison, every month, Meta spends somewhere between $100 and $200 million on Anthropic tokens. Right. They're one of the biggest buyers of AI from Anthropic. And if anybody was going to distill, they would have been distilling for the last year to 2 years, and they just finally got a model out that is somewhat competitive in the last week or two, right? So they have the highest per capita payroll of any lab in the world. They have some of the most number of compute, and they have the most number of tokens that they're buying from Anthropic. Why can't they have gotten a Kimi K3 thing out 6 months ago? Right.
The public argument, I mean, this has been widely reported, that Meta internally is utterly paranoid of being accused of distilling Anthropic traces and actively encouraging their engineers, don't use it, don't overuse it, don't you dare allow any Anthropic reasoning traces into the development of the Muse series. They're utterly afraid of being sued by Anthropic for reasoning trace distillation.
I'm not sure if I agree with that, given how much they're spending. But here, let me give you an example. What about XAI? Right, they also have access to these, and I don't think Elon has that same concerns over doing anything to speed himself up. right? And only in the last 2 weeks have they come out with something that is, relatively competitive, right?
Well, so Elon is an interesting case because he's at this point, I would argue, a frenemy of Anthropic. He acquired his entity, SpaceX AI, acquired Cursor, and Cursor was arguably, at least recently, a post-trained version of Kimi that was being post-trained off of reasoning traces via Cursor that were being, in many cases, siphoned off from interaction with Claude. So Elon has, I think the Steelman case for Elon and the Grok series, the recent Grok models, is in some sense, he has like 2 layers of plausible deniability, but he's basically doing the same thing that the Chinese labs are being accused of.
Ask Claude in Chinese what model it is, and for a while it answered that it was Qwen.
The key to realize, if you look at all the papers that are coming, like half the papers around AI are coming out from Chinese organizations, right? And they are actually innovating. It's not that distillation was why they're successful. If you look at how they were able to reduce their KV cache usage by 20x, and these are not things that you get from distillation. You cannot distill something from somebody that other people didn't have. So we can't take that away from them. As Dave said, they're smart people there. They're doing innovative things, and that's part of the reasons why they're successful. Did they distill? Probably. I'm sure they have. But same, the U.S. models have also distilled from Chinese, right? I think there was a couple models ago where if you use Chinese to ask Anthropic Claude what model you are, and it said I'm Qwen, right? So when I was at the Alibaba labs, and they were kind of laughing about that too. They're like, yeah, they're distilling from us. We just can't tell because they already downloaded our models, so we don't know. Right. But I don't think that the whole distillation issue is really as big. In fact, if you look at what happened last week with Zuck, he's actually saying distillation is actually a good thing. We don't think distillation should be prevented. And they're kind of jumping on the whole open source thing, and they're saying, hey, AI should be free. Right. So
now the part that should stop you. China cannot buy Blackwell chips. So the frontier training runs for Chinese models are not happening in China at all.
They are building, giant, solar farms and wind farms on the west side and in the desert parts of China, and then using their very high voltage power transmission that, essentially 1,000 miles, you lose less than 1% of the electricity when you use these high voltage things. And they're bringing the energy to the east where most of the population is living, right? And, but they are also building some data centers right where these the power generation is happening, so that you don't have stranded power, and they're able to deliver compute at a fraction of the cost of the U.S. because their energy cost is around 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, right? Which is in some cases 10 or maybe 15 times cheaper than many parts of the U.S. Right. So, and I think in the long run, that's actually where the constraint will be. And I think you're right. Right now they don't have enough chips. They can't buy enough chips, and they can't make enough chips, right? Because their capacity is limited by the fact that they don't have EUV machines, right? So when I was in China, and every lab I talked to, I said, hey, do you guys have no compute? They're like, no, this is our biggest issue. We don't have compute. So from a export control, are we slowing down China? Yeah, I think that export controls of chips is slowing down China. Now, the one thing that most people don't realize is that the actual training right now that is happening is not even happening in China because they don't have the Blackwell generation chips in China, right? And so they're actually doing it in international data centers, training it, and then bringing back on a disk or something, So it's.
Wait, say that again. That's incredibly important information.
Oh yeah, what? This is actually not a secret. I think people in both
this
sides.
This has been widely reported.
Yeah, in both sides.
What's the point of a chip embargo? What is the purpose of an embargo?
Well, I think it's more optics than anything right now. Right.
Oh my God.
Now, but from an inference perspective, most of the inference is being served to Chinese people in China, and that is an area where the limitations of resources is slowing them in terms of how many new users they can add and so forth. And I think you guys alluded to some of that in your prior episodes. So The export controls, yes, it has slowed down China. It's made their life more difficult, but it also has created the necessity for innovation. So back to what Peter was asking earlier, was export controls good or bad? I would tell you this. The day, or maybe like the week after we stopped the Chinese from buying all of the high-end chips from the U.S., I had calls with a few of my friends who are in the semiconductor industry, and every one of them got calls saying, "Hey, would you like," calls from the government saying, "Hey, would you like some extra funding? Would you like extra resources? How can we help you accelerate? Could we get you customers?" And I know a few of the CEOs of these Chinese GPU companies, and they were saying nobody wanted to buy our stuff. We're 2 or 3 generations behind. We were less energy efficient, but now we can't make enough because every data center in China has to buy our stuff. And so we would have died if it wasn't for American policies. So essentially, we created the current competition of all of these, the Morthreads and Cambricons and Birins of China would not be as successful, or maybe would have gone bankrupt if it wasn't because of American policies. And now within the next 2 or 3 years, they will start to catch up to what America is doing, and they will start to export their chips. And that would not have been the case if it wasn't for us forcing them to survive.
So Washington looked at all of that and decided the answer was more controls, not fewer.
Utterly backfired and misguided.
Yeah, and unfortunately right now, if you talk to the folks in DC, they're doubling down on this, right? Right now, they want to keep adding and making these things more difficult. How can we get the foreign, the international data centers that are being used by these Chinese to not be, accessible? And they're adding more and more layers and more KYC. And I think that those are the kind of things that actually will backfire more economically, more geopolitically than economically, because then that forces irrational behaviors. Like, they're now trying to keep us from progressing as a nation. Then behavior gets more aggressive, and
the export controls run both directions now, and the smuggling has reversed.
Robots today, 90% of their components are coming from China. Right. If we put an embargo on them, in fact, there was rumors now that was funny that now U.S. robotics companies are now sneaking to China, buying these components, putting them into suitcases, and then bringing them back. Right? They're now sneaking the other way. The Chinese were going around and buying GPUs and sneaking them back. Now the American robots companies are going to China and sneaking back components and actuators that they couldn't get in the U.S. Right? So I think we need to understand that the world is interconnected. We are highly dependent on each other. This has been the globalization concept has been something that's been going on for the last 100 years. And I don't think we can stuff that genie back in the bottle, right? I think it's great that we want to create domestic independence the same way that China has. They spent, the last 10, 15 years, building out their own capabilities, building out energy generation, building out telecom systems so that they wouldn't be dependent on third parties, because they've seen how reliant on 1 or 2 countries, and when policies change, it could hurt them, right? And so some of the things that we've done really have allowed them to, and gave them the motivation to be as strong in terms of taking short-term hits for long-term independence.
Both countries published an AI plan. Only one of them is about actually using it.
2 years ago, a year and a half ago, they came out with something called the AI Plus plan. I'm sure you guys have probably heard about it, but
we've talked about it on the pod.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So essentially, their idea is, hey, within the next 5 years, we want to have 70% of companies integrate AI into their business, whether it's manufacturing or education or medicine or so forth. And within the next 10 years, we want to have 90+%. Right. So there's a specific goal, and it's all about diffusion and deployment into industry and society. This is a little bit different than the American AI Action Plan, right? That came out last year. And the American AI Action Plan is saying it's on the supply side. How can we create the best models? How can we dominate in the best chips? But it doesn't talk about what happens after. Right. So I think the two countries have a very different focus in terms of their AI plan. There was nothing in the AI Plus plan that says we have to get to AGI, that we have to dominate this. It says, how do we get more industries to use this? How do we adopt it in a smooth, safe way so that it grows the economy? That was all they cared about.
I'd love to develop this a little bit more. From my perhaps jaded perspective, I look at Chinese industrial policy and I look at Wang Huning, who, for those who are not tracking, is sort of the CCP's chief ideologue, author of many of the policies, or at least a primary author, maybe you can correct me, Alvin, of policies, signature policies like Belt and Road Initiative and so on. And I look at Chinese state capacity, like the Eastern Data, Western Computing mega project, to put compute and power in the West, where energy is cheaper and more available, and put the data in the East, where the mega cities are. And I just look at Chinese state capacity on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I look at the West, where historically, again, maybe you'd have a different position, where in the U.S., historically, at least in the post-World War II era, we've had relatively, by comparison, weak industrial policy. It's only relatively recently that the U.S. government has decided that having a strong and centralized industrial policy is a good idea. So putting this in question form for you, Alvin, if you buy, to the extent you buy any of those premises, if you could be supreme leader of the U.S. or the Western Bloc or the Pax Silica for a 5-year plan for the West, what would your 5-year plan be for the West to leapfrog China's AI Plus and other Wang Huning style ideological 5-year plans? What is it that we need to do?
Let me finish. That They're mistaking anxiety for ambition. All right. Let me explain that. The Western world has a history of expanding. Whether you're talking about Greece or Rome or Pax Britannica or right now Pax Americana, right? We've expanded. The Chinese actually haven't. They haven't had this idea. They've essentially been in that little sphere of that central space, and they used to call themselves the Middle Kingdom, right? Because they thought we already have everything. We don't need to expand, right? Now, one of the things that goes back to Chinese history is during the Qing dynasty, because of their hubris to say, hey, we don't need anything from the West. We already have all the technology. They stopped going out and exploring and learning, and they fell behind. Right? They stopped their industrialization. They started to build, summer palaces instead of navies. And then the eight powers came and essentially took over China for 100 years. Right? That history has left a very deep mark in the psychology of the Chinese to say
a century of humiliation.
Exactly. They don't want to repeat that again. And so they say we need to become a strong country so that never happens again. And it's important for us to continue to innovate and to continue to learn from the rest of the world. From, I think, any country's perspective, that's probably what we all want, including the question that Alex has said. How can America also learn from that to say, how can we become strong, independent, and resilient country? In fact, America has actually moved away from, post-World War II, we were 50% of the manufacturing capability of the entire world, right? And at that point, the world depended on us. Right now, what's happening is around 35% of the global manufacturing capabilities in China, about 15% in the U.S., right? And I think the forecast is it's going to go to 40 or 45% over the next 5 or 10 years. So
in China.
Yeah, in China, right? So, this is the thing is America right now is very good at financial services, creative services, consulting services, things that are informationally driven and things that are actually highly susceptible to AI exposure for displacement, right? So we are right now running this race to get to AGI, which is the force that will actually displace us from global preeminence, because we are commoditizing the very sectors that we are strong in the world. So this is something that we need to be very careful of. Why are we running this fast to go to something that actually creates major disruption and instability in our country?
Well, I can answer that one for you, and then I'll repose my same question back to you, Alvin. So I think the answer is that the goal of capitalism fundamentally is to burn itself out. And the irony here, right? The goal is to take what's scarce and make it abundant. And right now, to the extent that human services labor is scarce, and we see that with Balmol's cost disease, the goal of superintelligence, one of the goals at least, or instrumentally convergent sub-goals, is to make the equivalent of human service labor abundant, make it too cheap to meter, as it were. I think that's the goal, and not some sort of like stasis or equilibrium where it remains scarce.
We need to separate kind of national strategy from just capitalistic philosophical bent, right? And in fact, you're right. I think that if you look at capitalism, and the ultimate destination, capitalism is a single company monopoly of the world. Right. That is, and that is actually a very unhealthy thing. So here's something I just heard from David Sachs and Gavin Baker, and on their All In 2 days ago. Gavin Baker said, there's been conversations in Anthropic where Dario's told his team that in the near future, there will only be one company in the world, one private company in the world, and it will be Anthropic, and then there will be governments. Right. I think that is a very scary thing. I think that is a very delusional thing. And I don't know if that is something that is good for America, right, or for the world.
I agree pretty out there and wrong. I mean, I just don't see how that gets there.
Yeah, no, I think it's realistic.
A lot of great.
But I think that the mindset that he has right now, and this is the issue, is that we are essentially creating national strategy based on the aspirations of a couple of companies today.
I'd like to, though, Alvin, just pull back to the original question, which is you get to be strategy czar, you get to be Wang Huning for the West, as it were. It sounded like what you were saying is your thesis is that superintelligence is going to disrupt the Western, right now, economic dependence on service labor. And I think the implication was that manufacturing is a more stable fixed point for long-term economic vibrance. Am I reading you correctly that your positioning would be basically Western reindustrialization?
Everyone assumes the biggest model is the most dangerous model. Graylin published a paper last week arguing the opposite.
That is really important, is that there's a perception that these models are going to get more and more dangerous the bigger they get. So this goes back to a paper I just released last week, called, bigger models are not the most dangerous, right? And it was released on Cipher Brief, which is a national security outlet in DC that is read by most of the national security population. And what that data did was, I went back and I looked at across the board from security use, national security use cases, from biological, chemical, cyber use cases for AI, and what I found was across millions of parameters to trillions of parameters, there was no correlation between risk in the real world versus size of models. Right, you had 10 to 50 million parameter models for chemicals that were creating kind of chemical warfare weapons. Right, you had 10 to probably 1 to 10. 1 to 50 billion parameter models that were able to create viruses and genetically engineered beings or harmful agents, right? And then you had essentially kind of 1 to 100 billion parameter cyber models that was as dangerous or more dangerous than the leading
Fable 5, right? Mythos.
And Mythos, right? And in fact, the harness actually now for cyber is more important than the models themselves. All right, so M-Dash from Microsoft has came out with I think a cyber gem score of 95, and Mythos was 83 or 84. Right, and what M-Dash did was it took 100 little tiny models and just organized them together to use different skill sets. Right, so I think we need to understand that. The danger is already there today, particularly in the biochemical side of things, right? And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's really working on protecting the world from those agents, because a 10 million or a 1 billion or a 5 billion parameter model will run on your laptop in your basement, and you can design these genes, or design these chemical weapons. But what now needs to happen is those are already out, right? A lot of those are open source. Those are already out. How do we make sure that the precursors are controlled, that these systems are creating, right? How do we make sure that the synthesis machines that will generate these designs into real genetic material are controlled? And these are the kind of things that should be higher up in the agenda. And it's not right.
Britain's AI Security Institute measured the cyber attack capability of the Chinese frontier models against Mythos and GPT 5.6.
AI Security Institute just came out with a new report last month. And what it showed was the cyber threat capabilities of the leading open models, including Kimi, was about a half of the capabilities of the Mythos and GPT 5.6 models in terms of their cyber attack capabilities, right? And the other thing that was interesting was that there's different levels of attacks, of how many levels of attacks can you get to. And for their highest level, none of the Chinese models were able to autonomously attack and control a external system, right? So I think out of the 30-something levels, the average American models were able to get to 20, 25 in terms of how far they went in terms of attacking a network. And I think none of the Chinese were able to get to the higher levels, and a very small number got to like the lower levels, like 4 or 5 or something. So from a threat security perspective, these models, even though they're just as big as some of the leading U.S. models in terms of size of parameters, they're actually less dangerous. And one thing I do want to point out is what you said earlier was, from a defense perspective, you actually want bigger models as a defender, because for defense, you have to look across all of the potential holes you have in an organization and to be able to then find it and patch it. Whereas an attacker, you just need to find one hole. Once you have that one hole, then you just go in through that hole. So it's a very asymmetric equation between attackers and defenders. You don't need very large models to attack, but you need larger models to defend.
The flaw in all of that.
There is a reason the giant models end up being the safe ones. It is not the model, it is the cage around it.
Well, I mean, I think that the whole world right now is talking about RSI, and I think we need to separate the concept of whether or not something can improve itself versus the danger that a larger model poses versus a small model. The one thing to remember is that larger models actually require significant compute resources, and which means that they'll probably be hosted on a cloud system. And if they're hosted on a cloud system, you can get telemetry, you can look at the prompt logs, and
Exactly.
from a government perspective, you can actually manage it, right? And most of the larger models are run with harnesses that are being managed by the cloud providers, so that you can add added levels of security and detection, which was what that's what separates Mythos from Fable, is the harness that says, hey, don't do these things, right? So it neutered the Mythos system. This is why in my paper I talk about why larger models are not necessarily the most dangerous. There's a raw capability, and then there's a effective deploy capability, and larger models have actually a lower effective deployed because of the wrapper that you can put around it.
Yes.
Harvey runs the legal profession's AI. It is built on GLM 5.1, a Chinese open weight model. Almost nobody is running the frontier.
Parameters. In fact, if you look at whether drug discovery or legal use cases or like open evidence, I think was based on GPT-4. Was what their system is based on, right? You look at Harvey, which is the leading legal use case system. It's based on GLM 5.1. Right. So, I mean, and it was upgraded. It used to be based on some other open source model from 2 years ago. So they're not using the latest and greatest. So in April this year, I wrote a paper with Eric Brynolfsson at the Digital Economy Lab, and it's called the Enterprise AI Playbook. Right? We went and talked to hundreds of companies, found 50 that successfully deployed them around the world in 10 different countries, 10 different sectors. And what we found was that the technology was not the issue. right? In 80, 90% of the cases, it was all organizational issues of why, what slowed it down, right? In fact, only 10% of people said we really cared. Technology was the main roadblock for us, right? So the AI that we have today is already good enough to solve real world business issues around the world.
Here is the frame that reframes the whole episode. We think we are in a prisoner's dilemma. Graylin says we picked the wrong game.
The world is actually a multi-turn game. And even in Prisoner's Dilemma, a multi-turn game, the game theory optimal is tit for tat, which means you start with actually cooperation, and if they defect, you defect. And then you essentially signal each other, and long term, you actually both go to cooperation. Right? Now, in a stag hunt game, it's actually, and the Prisoner's Dilemma essentially is a zero-sum game. Right? In the stag hunt game, it's actually a positive sum game. And whether you both defect or you both cooperate, you get a stable two Nash equilibriums. Right? And what that means is that those can actually stay in perpetuity, whether you both decide to defect or not. Now, the difference is we're right now playing the Prisoner's Dilemma game where we're defecting. But if we're in the game that is the stag hunt, the stag hunt was actually something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau invented, which is the idea that two hunters go into a forest, and you could decide today: do I go for the rabbits or do I go for the stag? The big game. And the big game, because it's bigger, I need two people to hunt together and to bring it back. If I go hunt by myself, the stag, I don't get anything. If I go for the rabbits by myself, I can get a couple rabbits, feed my family for a week or a couple days. And if I get the stag, we'll both feed our families for a month, right? That's the idea of the stag hunt. And right now, we're actually doing the worst thing. We're going to go for the stag, and China's going for the hare, right? They're going for the good enough AI, the one that helps the economy today. And we're going for the giant AGI, the thing that's going to solve everything, right? And when you do that alone, what that creates is the worst situation, which is if America doesn't get there, or if it gets there and cannot control it and it runs away and it's not safe, then it gets zero. Whereas China continues to do their little gains and continue to survive. So the optimal solution for a stag hunt game is actually first both slow down, both make good enough stuff, get to a point where the technology is helping grow the economy, and now we sort of understand how to manage it, and then together go hunt the stag. Right, that's the optimal strategy for the relation to how AI and game theory works. But we've put ourselves into this game theory of Prisoner's Dilemma, where we think just defect, and it's a self-imposed game.
So if you got to write the West's strategy instead, what would you actually build?
What I would do is actually create high-quality open source. Right, because then you're competing on a even
ecosystem to ecosystem.
Yeah, ecosystem. Right. Right now, China is open source. So the question is, do I pay $50 per million token, or do I pay the cost of electricity? And for most people, based on what you just said earlier, they don't need the frontier. Right. 90% of people are fine with today's models. I mean, especially when you have things like Kimi and GLM and DeepSeek 5, you're already at a level that is higher than the needs of the average person.
And now the twist that should make every ASI-pilled listener sit up. The Chinese open weight models may have saved the West from itself.
Maybe just to say something nice about China, since I guess I've been playing the role to some extent of China hawk in this conversation, I would point out, and curious, Alvin, to hear your thoughts on this, that the present situation where even as of a few months ago, I think the West was at risk of succumbing to regulatorily captured duopoly of Anthropic and OpenAI dominating the future light cone, and then not unlike, maybe by analogy, the Qing dynasty, where the U.S. could have sort of turned inward on itself. Chinese open weight models obtained, however, have basically forced open the U.S., call it a reverse Qing. And now finally we have real competition at the AI frontier, thanks ironically to Chinese competition. Do you think we find ourselves now in a reverse Qing?
Yeah, in some ways. In fact, I think it's maybe the more appropriate analogy is actually where if we roll back to time, I would roll back to the Cold War, where the U.S. and the USSR were competing on a arms race. And essentially, the reason we won was not because we sent a missile and blew up Russia, right, or Soviet Union. It's because they bankrupted themselves building military arms, and up to 20% of their GDP was building arms that was not creating real value for their society. In some ways, this is what China is doing to us, right? They're spending 1/10 as much on data centers, and getting to 97% as good. And what we are doing right now, leveraging, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? You had last week, NVIDIA announced that they have a $500 billion deal with BlackRock and Carlyle and Blackstone and so forth to essentially securitize, chips and compute, right? This sounds a lot like the subprime issues.
Wow. Wait, so this is the most astonishing thing. And this is also to your credit, Alvin, the first time I've heard anyone basically analogize the credit, I don't want to say bubble, but the enormous amount of private credit that the West is allocating to compute, analogizing that to a reverse SDI Star Wars moment that could, presumably what you're gesturing at is that could lead to the proverbial Chinese century and the collapse of Western dominance. Is that the thesis?
Well, I hope it doesn't happen, but I think we are pushing ourselves in that way. We're actually right now acting like USSR, and see what perpetuated the arms race was this missile gap. Right. And the idea that, they have more missiles, we have more missiles. And at both cases, they were both having the wrong numbers being provided to the leadership. They said, we need to build more because they have, 30,000. We only have 20,000. How would they go? And it became, we had 70 or 80,000 missiles between us that would have blown up the world, hundreds of times. Well, there was no need for any of that, right? And in some ways, we're kind of doing the same thing right now with AI, where we right now 45% of the U.S. stock market value is in AI sector. Right, that is a very, very fragile place for us to be. At the height of the internet bubble, I think around 30% of the stock market was internet companies. Right, I don't know if you guys heard of something called the Buffett indicator. Right, the Buffett indicator is something that says a market is healthy when your stock market is the same value as your GDP. Okay, and at the height of the internet bubble, we were around 120% of the GDP was the stock market value. Right now, we are at 240% of the GDP is the U.S. stock market value. Right. In fact, the AI sector alone is worth more than the GDP of America today. Right. That to me is a sign that we are in a very, very fragile place, and a economic correction is due. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but Buffett's a pretty smart guy, and he's been doing this for a while.
Are you saying that the U.S. is the Soviet Union, the USSR in 1988, or are you saying that the U.S. is Japan in '89?
I think they're two different. I actually think that we are right now, the overinvestment that we've put into infrastructure for AI, especially when we both, what we just talked about, that it is an industry that will become commoditized. Not saying that AI is not amazing. AI is going to do amazing things. But the companies who are investing it are not going to be the ones that profit from it. Right, and that is going to create a major instability in the economics of the country. And if we don't manage it well, it could create a major crisis of what happened in the USSR during the late 80s.
So you think we're overvaluing the frontier labs and undervaluing the sort of China AI plus type rest of the economy that should be the applications?
That was the ASI-pilled episode 281. Kimi K3 trained outside China and flown home on a disk, DeepSeek cracking open a duopoly, and 45% of the American stock market riding on one bet. Our guest says we are playing the USSR. We, the ASI-pilled, are still taking the curves seriously. Until next time.